I rise to speak on the Fire Services Property Amendment Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund Bill 2024. And Acting Speaker, another day, another big tax from the Allan Labor government. If day doesn't go by in this place where we are not either debating some form of legislation on crime that does nothing to address crime in this state, where we're not debating some piece of legislation that has something to do with housing, yet nothing to actually increase the supply of housing in this state or improve affordability, or, of course, we are debating another tax on Victorians. And the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund, the tax that this government is putting in place is simply another big tax on Victorian taxpayers, because this government cannot manage money and Victorians are paying the price. Now, this piece of legislation replaces the Fire Services Property Levy, which previously funded both the CFA and the FRV. And the Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund will now fund a raft of organisations and emergency services, including the CFA and the FRV, Victorian State Emergency Services, 000 Victoria, Emergency Management Victoria, the Secretary of the Department of Justice and Community Safety in relation to their emergency management, and the Secretary of DECA to fund forest fire management. Acting Speaker, before this bill was introduced, all of these emergency services, other than the CFA and FRV, were funded through consolidated revenue in this state, through the taxes that were already being collected by this government from Victoria. But because this government has managed Victoria's books so poorly, because debt is soaring towards $188 billion, with the interest repayments set to reach $1 million a day in the coming years, this government now has to slug Victorians with a big new tax to fund the very services that it should be and has been funding from consolidated revenue. Acting Speaker, if we go back to the history of the Fire Services Property Levy and how it came about, I was speaking to the former Treasurer, the member for Malvern, and to how it was put in place at the time and in what was a true tax reform piece of legislation. It did replace stamp duties that existed on insurance, and it was a recommendation that came out of the Royal Commission to make sure that every Victorian was paying their fair share when it comes to management of our emergency services and our fire services here in Victoria. Now, under the watch of the then Treasurer, the member for Rowville, who did an exemplary job when it came to actually undertaking tax reform in this state, because when the former Treasurer put in place the Fire Services Property Levy, what did it do? It actually reduced the tax take by $100 million per year. It actually cost Victorians less when that levy was put in place and stamp duties were taken off insurance products. And what did that mean in a real way? It meant that rural and regional Victorians actually paid $120 less on average a year, that metropolitan homeowners actually paid $50 less per year. Now, contrast that to the bill we have before us today, Acting Speaker, whereby commercial properties are seeing a 100% increase on the rate put on them. Industrial properties, a 64% increase. And for primary production, a 189% increase in the levy that is being put on those property owners. And for households around the state, the households that are going to be slugged with this levy, $60 more. $60 more. So if you contrast that to the approach of the Coalition under the former Treasurer, the member for Rowville and the member for Malvern, that undertook tax reform that actually ensured that there would be less of a tax burden on Victorians, that there would be $100 million less in tax revenue collected, saving Victorians, compared to this government that at every opportunity looks for a way to slug Victorians more in tax. This is a tax that has had no consultation with the local councils that have been tapped on the shoulder by this government to say, well, we're going to put in place a new tax, but we don't really want to collect it. We don't really want to be the bad guys in this situation, so we're going to make local councils collect this tax. You can slog it on ratepayers. No consultation as to how that will happen, how that administrative burden will be placed on local councils, and that's why I support the reasoned amendment put in place by the member for Brighton to ensure that there is consultation undertaken. There is consultation undertaken. Acting Speaker, we've heard a lot today about the incredible work of our volunteers when it comes to emergency services, and of course those paid workers when it comes to emergency services. I think we all thank them for their incredible sacrifice and the work that they do. But what is not clear under this piece of legislation is how those volunteers will be given a rebate when it comes to this levy. Now, the government has said that volunteers will be given a leave pass when it comes to this levy, but there's no detail. There's no detail as to what that means. And from our understanding, what it means is they're going to have to pay it, and then we'll work out the detail later. Maybe you'll have to fill in a form to try and claim it back. So our volunteers who give up their time, in many ways and many times sacrifice their lives, put on the line their own lives for their local communities, they are going to be slugged with this big new tax, and there is no plan, there is no detail as to how that can be claimed back. It is unacceptable that once again we are seeing this government rush in, tax first, and work out the details later. Acting Speaker, there is one reason and one reason alone why we are here debating this bill today. There is one reason why we are now seeing a big new tax put on Victorians who already pay the highest taxes in the nation. The highest taxes in the nation. They pay the highest property taxes in the nation. And we've seen from the Allan Labor government, time and time again, introduce new taxes. More than 60 new taxes, fees and charges over the course of the past decade under this government. And if you ask Victorians, are you better off? Do you have access to better services? I promise you, Acting Speaker, it will be a resounding no from Victorians. But the one reason why this tax has to be introduced today, why the services that were previously funded under consolidated revenue now need to come from a new levy on Victorians at a time Victorians can least afford it, is because this government cannot manage money. $188 billion of debt in the coming years, $1 million a day in interest repayments under this government's watch. And why? Because we are seeing cost blowouts on major projects. Over $50 billion of cost blowouts on major projects. Just today, another example of the blatant waste and mismanagement of taxpayers' money when it comes to the Westgate Tunnel. Another $1 billion. And why? Why are these projects blowing out? Why are these major projects blowing out and Victorians having to pay the price through new taxes like this? Because this government is more interested in cozying up to the CFMEU, these thugs on building sites, on government-run building sites, and funneling money to the CFMEU, organised crime, bikies and thugs than it is in actually protecting the interests of Victorian taxpayers, actually making sure that Victorian taxpayers are getting value for their taxpayer money, getting value when it comes to funding these essential services, emergency services, through consolidated revenue, not by putting a big new tax on every single Victorian property owner because this government cannot manage money. Acting Speaker, it was Margaret Thatcher that says, eventually you run out of other people's money. I knew they would love that, but